can you tell me about the Edwards desk?
Are you filming? Oh, you are? Okay. So, this piece here is traditionally known as the Jonathan Edwards desk. It sat for many years in the basement of the old Yale Divinity building, which is just near here where we are on High Street. It was at the corner of Elm and College, I believe it was, and before it moved up the hill. And they found it there, and it was in pretty bad shape. Some things had to be repaired. I think the lid was replaced. But this is as far as I'm concerned, beyond a doubt, this is Jonathan Edwards' desk, and we can go through some evidences for that. At its core, it's a William and Mary era slant-topped desk with bun feet. This is probably a Boston piece made somewhere in the first quarter of the 18th century, and we estimate that Edwards probably bought this in 1727 when he was established at Northampton. He's getting married and he's getting established, and this was one of the kind of necessary items for setting up a household, especially for a minister. So it's a sign of his profession, but it's also a kind of a status symbol as well. So that he could use it for his writing, but also when he received people in, kind of where he sat. And, it would be the place where he would discourse with them. It's quite customary for the time. It's got a number of pigeonholes and little cubby holes for storing things, and you could keep your items in these kind of writing items and other things in these little drawers or in here. So he would have had this desk here during his time in Northampton through 1750. And one thing that he did with his sermon manuscripts, let me just put this lid up. When he came to Northampton, he had been writing manuscript sermons, basically 4x6 inch formats. What's called octavo format. And when he arrived, he not only was under the eye of Solomon Stoddard, who disapproved of the use of minutes or notes in the pulpit, but he also acquired this desk. And whether he, by design or by chance, the drawers of this desk are 4 1/4 inches deep.
Okay.
And that may have, in conjunction with his grandfather's disapproval of minutes or large sermon notes, it may have compelled him to go to a smaller format,
okay.
More of a duodecimo side, because that's 4 inches.
Yeah,
high,
4x4.
4 inches high, which would just fit in here, so he could line up all of his sermon notebooks, his sermon booklets, in these drawers, and because he identified each canonically up in the upper left-hand corner, and we estimate that this probably, all these drawers here together, if he's compacting them enough, he could probably have fit all or most of his sermons. We have over 1,200 of his sermons extant right now, and there were probably more. Of course, he repreaches a lot of them, and that he indicates in notes on the manuscript that he does that. But here's an interesting conjunction of kind of a material aspect that is driving the discursive aspect of things. So when he moves to Stockbridge in 1751, he visits the widow of his predecessor, Abigail Williams Sargent, who was a fascinating and formidable woman, highly intelligent, and a real kind of one of what we would call an influencer today, very much so. But he visits her, and he wants to make a good impression on her. And one thing he notices in the study is a cabinet, or a kind of a chest in there that Reverend Sargent used up till the time he died. And the bottom of it is cabinets, and then the upper part are these series of horizontal boxes. Boxes just like this, except narrower. Sargent's is more like this wide. Edward sees that and he's like, I wonder if I could do something with that. And we think he commissioned the same carpenter who did Sargent's to do these. And so what we think he adds at this time are the flanking cabinets, and then this series of horizontal boxes. They're all independent. See, they're not attached. They're all so they're easily portable. If you need to move the whole system, it's pretty easily done. You don't have these one big piece of or clunky piece of furniture you have to move. You could take them down, you put them on the cart, and off you go. So this is where he would put both books and manuscripts. And we know that he used this for those purposes because we actually have references in the manuscript corpus in which he refers to distinct portions of the desk, or the as he calls it, the scrutery, which is the escritoire in French, yes. Because he refers to manuscripts that are in, actually in this area right here, the short box to the left. He refers to the drawers in these flanking cabinets, which you'll notice on the one side, he divides into quarto size. So he could put his quarto size notebooks there. And then this side, he has his folios. Isn't that something? And so he actually refers to pieces that are in these drawers.
And just so I have it straight, a folio is a sheet that's folded in half. A quarto,
one full sheet folded in half, right?
A quarto is folded in four. Octavo, eights. And duodecimo, 12. But all started from the same size paper.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, that's how paper would come back then, in these large sheets, right? And you'd buy a ream of this.
Quire.
Or a quire. Well, a quire actually refers to a way of folding sheets. So if you do an infolded quire, you would take a stack of these pieces of paper and fold them over like that. That's called an infolded quire. You could have a stacked quire too, which is often what he did. He would take single pieces, or he would take just one fold, and he'd just stack those up. It was a very efficient system for him because he could stick in inserts where he needed to. He could move things around if he needed to, and then when it was to his satisfaction, then he could bind it. Bind it up.
Kimnock, in the introduction to the first Yale volume of the sermons, has this great introduction that could probably sell as a book on its own. And he talks about how he would, please correct me if I'm not thinking about this correctly, did Edwards unstitch and restitch some of these together?
Yeah, sometimes he did. Sometimes he did. For instance, I think the Controversies notebook, the pieces of that were one time all separate, or parts of other notebooks even. And sometime toward the end of his life, he brought all those together and united them. Probably they had something to do with the deist controversy. They were kind of hot topics in theological dispute at the time.
But even in the sermons, when Edwards went from manuscript to notes, he would sometimes put like a letter A or some sort of that there's an insertion there. Did Edwards leave those things in there, or did he return them to like leave the insertions in the new sermon, or did he eventually return them to the original sermon?
Sometimes he would do that. Sometimes he would leave them there.
Okay.
You know, sometimes they're just missing
Okay.
as well.
So in the sermon editing project, how did you guys like figure out, hey, something's missing here and we don't know where it came from, or like how big of an issue was that when you're trying to sort these?
Well, first of all, a surprising number of the sermon manuscripts are fairly intact.
Okay.
So that wasn't too much of a problem. Sometimes he would, tip in a leaf or two for a later repreaching or something like that. But it didn't present a huge problem. There's also a number of fragments that have survived, and we've actually been able to identify where some of those fragments
Oh, it came from? Oh, that's cool.
Because, when he redoes a sermon, he'll like, I don't really need this, I don't really need that, and he maybe adds a new portion, maybe he adds a new application or something like that to the sermon. And so we're able to do that. But let's face it, it's through very close examination of the handwriting and the ink and the watermarks, which is the procedure that was mastered by Tom Schaefer to do that, and that he taught me. Wilson Kimnack helped me to understand the sermons and the handwriting and the orthography and all that stuff. So I owe them, and Edward's scholarship owes them an awful lot.
Yeah.
There we go.
So you talked about the paper that Edwards used, and it seems like throughout his life, especially in Stockbridge, getting hold of paper he got more and more creative with that product. The picture that you included of the which notebook is that with the fan paper?
There are a number of those notebooks. It might be the Efficacious Grace.
Yes,
one of the
Efficacious Grace. That
books.
is impressive.
Yeah, he started using that kind of paper, which is kind of like a rice paper almost. It's so thin. He started using that around 1745 or thereabouts, which is right when his wife and his older daughters were starting to make fans for themselves. And you have to. So the process would be that you could buy the mounts, the ivory mounts in Boston, but then you could also buy the paper, and you could cut your own paper to fit on the mounts. And so they would actually decorate the paper with pen and ink and watercolor, and then they would cut them to size to fit the fan mounts. And then Jonathan, you have to picture Jonathan, the great theologian, going around and picking up all the scraps of paper. It's like, girls, where are all the fragments? So I need those for to save paper.
Well, I didn't know that goes back to 1745.
Thereabouts.
So it's not Stockbridge. It's a guess. King George's War is in full swing then. Possibly.
It's hard to get new paper, or it's very expensive. This is at a time too of there's pretty severe economic challenges going on. There's a serious inflation and devaluation of provincial currencies. So yeah, they were economizing to a great extent. And so this may have been one means of doing that. They would make their own fashion accessories, because no woman of gentry standing would go out into public without a fan. Right, that was a mark. Again, that was a mark of status.
Yeah.
And it showed your gentility. So they made kind of a virtue of necessity and made their own fans, and sometimes they even sold them or gave them away as gifts.
Yeah.
Things like
that.
So Yeah, any other questions
Well,
about
truthfully, you
the
answered,
desk?
you answered most of the ones I've written down quite quite specifically.
Yeah, it's so it's made of red walnut on the sides, and then red oak, and then black walnut in the front. And it's then when these were added, this is all pine, and these were stained to look like the desk. So they're quite nice, and it's quite clever. They're these little sliding doors that you open with these sinkholes, these little circular sinkholes. You just put your finger in there, and it slides right open. And when you need to slide it right shut. It happens now to be full of original. These are all original Edwards imprints right here. Some of them, including a whole stack of first edition sermons and treatises and some early biographies and things like that. So there are some real choice bibliographic items just sitting here in front of us.
Well, we'll get a shot of those.
Right.
So what other furniture from Edward's office still exists out there?
So the Lazy Susan table still is out there. So we know that from the inventory of his estate, he had the desk and the great bookcase. This would be the great bookcase. Then he had a smaller bookcase. We don't know the dimensions of that. And he had a writing table, which could have been any kind of household table drummed into service. And then he had the Lazy Susan table.
Yeah.
So just as Edwards had this custom designed for himself, he also had the Lazy Susan table designed for himself. And this is literally a table on a central pivot that has 6 sides to it that are sloped up with ellipse at the bottom, so that you could place printed and manuscript books on them, and you could sit at your desk. If he was sitting here at his desk, and he had the Lazy Susan table in his vicinity, he could just spin to the right one. It was an early form of Windows, I suppose, and recheck his reference, and keep going. He was right-handed, I'm left-handed. Sorry, but he's right-handed. So that's a really interesting. And that piece is at the Stockbridge Library Association in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. And please, I encourage viewers to go up to the Stockbridge Library Association and visit their historical collections, because they have some wonderful things. So.
And there's a rumor about the small writing table at the Mission House being part of his freedom of the will. Is that more rumor than it is?
Well, it's possible.
Possible? Well, yeah.
It's possible. So the language is that he wrote the treatise on that bench, which is like a little low. It's really, I think he probably may have sat on it while he
That's funny.
was doing it. What's interesting about that little table, which sits about as high as a chair, is that the edges were literally, you could see the edges were rived down so that they were smooth, which suggests to me that he used it as a sitting stool, that he could pivot easily. If he had the desk, he had the writing table, he had this Lazy Susan, he could kind of pivot around easily. He didn't have to encounter a back of a chair and move the chair around. He could just kind of pivot on the stool itself. So this is
it's fun to think
it's
about.
Speculative.
Well, even Terry Miller used the term historical imagination, and I think that is.
So that's what we have to use a little bit here.
Yeah. So Jefferson had a similar sort of, not a Lazy Susan, but a multi-angled something. That's okay. It's a shotgun mic.
Yes, Jefferson did have a book stand that could 5 books, and it was a desktop. We don't have a large enough desktop here, but he had it on the desk, and he could spin it as needed. And that's of course a later
Yeah.
It's a more space saving kind of device. Quite clever. But Edwards had this Lazy Susan table decades before.
Yeah.
So that was kind of neat to see that. It's a very interesting design. The bottom of it are clearly more Jacobean in appearance, very rounded, kind of sausage-like bolt turnings on that stuff. And then the top, the best we can describe it as shaker, because it's very plain.
Very austere, yeah.
And of course, the Shakers thrived in Western Massachusetts several decades after Edwards.
Yeah.
So it's part of a kind of a vernacular. It's kind of a vernacular style that I think the Shakers took on and made their own. But it was clearly more of a Connecticut, maybe a Connecticut Valley kind of aesthetic. That was very plain style kind of thing. But so where you have the plain style form of preaching, I think you have an analog actually in architecture and in furniture design.
Yeah.
The plain style.
Yeah.
So
Outstanding.
yeah, quality, good quality, but plain, not ostentatious. That's I think where they went. They were trying to go at least.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned in the article that maybe our primary, if not our sole source of Edwards' study habits is Samuel Hopkins.
He's one of them, yeah.
One of them.
He's important.
There's rumors of Edwards' study habits, 13 hours a day in the office, things like that. What's your sense of what his intellectual habits might really have been?
Well, he obviously was very disciplined. And I think he was a good organizer of his time. Did he spend 13 hours a day every day in his study? Obviously not.
Yeah.
The more I studied Edwards, the more I was impressed with actually how much he was either in the saddle or going somewhere by coach or by sloop or whatever. He was in motion an awful lot. Especially after the 1734 and 35 revival, he was in high demand. So he spent a lot of time away from home in that capacity. And but I think when he was at home, he would carve out as much time as he could to be there. And if opportunity presented, maybe a 13-hour day here and there, but day in and day out, I don't see it. I don't see it. It's not possible.
Well, and he seems like a fairly personable guy who was, despite how things ended, well loved by his congregation for a significant period of time at least. And it's my experience, you don't get there by spending 13 hours a day in the study.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, he by his own admission was not real big on pastoral visitation.
Yeah.
He wasn't a very social person. He was more reserved, and again, he admitted that. And so, it's a very different model from, say, Solomon Stoddard, who was very gregarious, obviously, and very much a presence in the lives of his people. And Edwards was kind of a little more removed. So I think that may have played in a bit to the alienation between him and his congregation. And there's also evidence, and you see it in the sermon manuscripts, that as the 1740s wear on, his perceived audience is changing. He's still obviously fulfilling his obligation to his congregation, but he also sees his audience as kind of the transatlantic revival community, and he's really moving in these treatises that he's writing. He's really addressing that. He's looking at becoming a part of the conversation in the Republic of Letters, and in the moral sense, philosophic community, and so on and so forth. So, in some ways, while there were certainly portions of the congregation that loved him right to the end, in some ways, Edwards and his congregation had parted ways
Yeah.
long before he was dismissed.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, I think Jerry McDermott makes the case that he had the opportunity to spend more time with children and with the wives and women who didn't have a vote when it came to whether or not he stayed. Yeah, and by personable, I don't necessarily mean social butterfly, but I don't think there's any evidence he was a cranky, crusty academic or anything.
No, not that, but he was not, by the same token, a warm and fuzzy kind
Okay.
of guy. And he was not someone who, at Hopkins says, he was not an affable, facetious gentleman, which was kind of the style of the time,
Yeah.
witty and so forth. That was not him. And so, perhaps a little bit out of step and a little bit removed, and that redounded, I think, on his relationship with the congregation.
Yeah.
So,
Well, this is a guy that wrote a resolution I resolve, was it not to laugh on Sundays or something like that, or was it not to laugh at all? I think it was just on Sundays.
well, he didn't indulge in certain kinds of laughter,
Okay.
which were, the laughter that screws up the face.
Uh,
That kind of laughter, that you give way to kind of an animal spirits and all of that. And, it's this unreasonable, uncharitable, almost kind of humor.
yeah.
He highly disapproved of that. So
Yeah, that's a very interesting disconnect between 18th century culture and today.
I mean, he was a very decorous individual. He's a very decorous individual, and had a sense of his own place in society, of his responsibilities, of his prerogatives as a clergy person. And he, in that time, it's a very deferential, hierarchical society. It's very strange to us today, because when you passed Mr. Edwards in the street, you would stand aside and you take your hat off, right? That's what you did back then. That was considered proper manners, and it's like, well, we wouldn't do that today. That's for sure.
I've been a pastor for a while. No one's taking their hat off.
No one's taking their hat off to you, except maybe to wallop you with it, or something like that. So yeah, it's a very different kind of world. That obviously they were thoroughly human like we are today with their foibles and so forth. But it requires a bit of this historical imagination that, as you talked about, to try to understand the world in which they lived. Which was a world that included gender bias and racial bias and slaveholding, which Edwards was a part of. And you have to think that it's at this very desk that he would have probably done some business relating to his slave owning, or
Possibly the draft letter that he...
writing his essay on slavery and the slave trade right at this very desk in 1741 or so thereabouts. So it's a complicated period for us to try to enter into, but it's very necessary too.